Hello and welcome to this luxury Nuno felt scarf workshop tutorial with me, Vivienne Morpeth. I'm going to take you through each step so you'll be able to stop and start the video just as you need to. To begin with, you take the bubble wrap and lay it out along the length of the table. Then take the backing silk chiffon, the very long length, and lay that on top of the bubble wrap. Get a thick felt pen and go round and lightly mark the edge around the circumference of the silk chiffon backing. This is so that you've got an idea of where you're going to place the surface decoration. The silk backing is then put to one side for later. Then take the bar of soap and immerse it in a bowl of warm water so that the soap infuses. Now take the bag and open the bag with the small pieces of specially hand-dyed silk which I prepared for you. These will make the surface pattern. Take your time and lay them out into a pattern that you like inside the margins of the frame that you've drawn on the bubble wrap. The bubble wrap should have the bubbles upside, I should say, and you can see that they're very slippery to handle, the silk. They catch on your fingers and on each other. You can lay them in strips, vertically or horizontally, and you can cut them into different shapes. I like to work with quite large pieces, and that gives me a larger surface area of pattern. Take the silks and mix them up. The very thin one is chiffon. This is more see-through, and it felts in beautifully, but it doesn't have a luster. And the other silk is habotai silk. This has a beautiful luster and gives a really thick texture on the surface of the pattern. You can cut these up and arrange them so that you can swap the different textures around. Then take the scissors and cut the pre-felt into different shapes. I often use pebble shapes, but circles work well, and squares and rectangles. Arrange these on the silk so that they give a pattern. Here I'm arranging them on the silk chiffon because that felts in very neatly around the edges. Place them at least 2 centimeters apart to allow space for the fibres of the wool and the silk to felt together. Try not to let them hang over the edge of the silk because they do migrate, they move when they're being felted. So I place them in the centre of the pieces of silk. It's nice to arrange them so that you have some at each end of the scarf, so that when you are wrapping the scarf around your neck, you can see the texture of the pebbles. Once the pebbles are arranged, check that the silk is all lying flat and unfold any edges. If it doesn't want to stay flat, sprinkle a little bit of the soapy water on it. Once you've done that, take the soapy water and sprinkle it all over the silk and the pebbles. Here I've used a milk container with some holes in the top, and I poured my soapy water into it. If you have a felting sprayer or a plant mister, you could use that as well. Something that is light and sprinkles rather than slooshes the water on. Then make sure that everything is nicely arranged. Sometimes the water can push the silk in different directions. Unfold any little edges so that they sit flat to the bubble wrap. Now take the wool and break it down into smaller lengths. So these lengths are about 30 centimeters long, and then I divide the length into narrow strips. I arrange a series of narrow strips in all the different colours along the table so that I have a palette of colours to work with. Then I imagine that one hand is like a hungry bird and it's pecking out the fibres. So I'm just pulling out small little wisps and laying them between all the lines, almost like tram lines. And you can mix the colours up so that you're creating a pattern. You'll see this wool on the surface of your scarf, and you lay these out so that it helps the silk felt together into the wool and creates this path-like pattern around, a little bit like stained glass windows. And here it's as though you're putting the lead in the stained glass window. This takes quite a bit of time and works well if you can tease out very small wisps of wool. If it comes out in too thick a clump to begin with, tease it out again, pull it again between your fingers so that it becomes finer and more delicate. The more wool you put in, the thicker the scarf is, and we're trying to create a delicate layer here. It's not always as easy as it looks, so if it does come out in a clump, just pull it again. You'll find that you'll need to keep drying your hands because the surface is wet and it's very hard to pull out the wool when you have wet hands. You can see here that I like to mix the colours up and to use them in quite stark contrasts. So I'm going all around in between each piece of silk and all around the circumference, around the outer edge of the silk, up and down the whole length of the scarf. And once I've done this, I'll just check that I've filled in all the different areas, especially the edges. Having gone all the way around the outside and filled all the tram lines, the next thing to do is to take the lengths of merino wool, pull off another length of each of the colours so that these are again about 30 centimetres long. Merino wool is quite hard to handle. You have to have your hands well apart to be able to separate the fibres. Then take these and we're going to begin to layer the whole of the backing with these. I line the fibres up so that they sit on the tips of my finger and then bring my hand round and tease out a wisp of these. And then I lay them along the long length of the scarf. I like to imagine that I'm tiling a roof and that these are all the tiles that I'm putting in place. They want to be nice and even and with no gaps in between, so that they overlap at the top and the bottom and the sides. It is quite tricky if you've not done this before, and sometimes it takes a bit of practice to tease out the fleece so that it comes out evenly. But don't worry, if it comes out in a clump, just again pull it between your fingers and thumbs to make it a bit finer. You can mix the colours up. It doesn't really show in the pattern on the other side. Sometimes I do it all in stripes, and sometimes like this I just mix them up and just enjoy working with the colours. You can see that you get a nice finished edge when you pull it at one way with your hand. So you can flick your hand over when you get to the edges so that you get this neat edge, as you can see I'm doing here. When you've gone all the way over your scarf and you've got nice fine layers, have a look and make sure there aren't any gaps. Then take the silk length that you used originally to draw around on the bubble wrap. Lay this carefully on top. If it's too big, it doesn't matter. Just shuffle it up slightly so that it fits onto the wool. You can tap it down lightly because it'll absorb some of the water from underneath. Then take your water sprinkler and sprinkle it on. The water will be quite cool by now, which is good for Nuno felting. Nuno felting needs the water to be nice and soapy, but not hot. Hot water will make the merino wool felt too quickly, and so that it doesn't felt into the silk fibres. The wool has to be wet and expand, and then it has to stretch and travel into the silk fibres the silk fabric in order to felt. So it needs to be wet all over, but not flooded. If it gets too wet, the silk pieces underneath will begin to slip around. So you can always use a sponge to dab off some of the extra water if it's too wet. It does need to be nice and soapy, so you can see I've gone back to the bowl with the soapy water in there, which I've left in all this time, and now I'm putting a bit more soap on my hands and then paddling it across the whole of the length of the scarf. The soap helps the fibres slip into the silk material. I'm gently patting it. I'm not rubbing it, although it does look a little bit like it. So all the air has been taken out of the wool, and I'm tapping it down now with my fingertips. I'm now just gently wiggling it underneath so that the silk material begins to cling on to the wet wool. Now the next thing to do is to make a nice edge, and you can do this by folding the edge of the bubble wrap to the edge of the silk, and it folds over those little wispy fibres that are hanging over the edge. So keep it like that whilst you're rolling. Sometimes it'll slip away, but you can fold it again. Mop up any extra water. Now the scarf is all ready to be wet felted, and we're going to do this by rolling it around the silver tube, the rolling rod. Take hold of the rolling rod and place it at one end of the bubble wrap. Slowly begin rolling the bubble wrap carefully around the silver tube. It can be quite difficult at times because there's so much water, but you can dab it with a cloth and that'll take out some of the excess water. Sometimes it helps if you lift the rolling rod slightly and it spreads the pressure and the volume so that it's easier to roll it up. Keep rolling all the way to the end and gently dab and ease the liquid and the volume of the silk. We want to avoid pushing too hard so that the silk underneath doesn't start moving around. Equally, we don't want to get rid of too much water because we need the water to help the felting process. Having rolled up the whole of the scarf in the bubble wrap around the silver rod, we're going to tie the sides together. Here I've used a pair of old tights, but torn off lengths of cloth, hair bubbles, elastic bands, they all work really well. Then we're going to start the rolling process. This is going to be done in groups of 100, rolling it backwards and forwards 100 times, then stopping and unrolling the whole of the scarf and rolling it up again from the other end. You can see that I've used a towel to help the roll to stop slipping on the table. And when you use a towel, make sure that the towel doesn't get anywhere near the scarf or the wool because it makes the felt go all fluffy. The first 100 rolls are hard work. They like to slip off the end and the silver rod keeps slipping out. But don't give up, it gets easier. After the first 100, carefully unroll the whole of your scarf. Move the silver rod to the other end, then roll it up again, ready for the next 100 rolls. So after we've finished rolling 400 times, that's 100 twice from each end, we're going to turn the whole scarf over. Then you get to see your wonderful design on the surface. Check to see that all the silk is lying nicely, but don't be tempted to rearrange it as it's partly felted and it will struggle to reattach if it's moved. But if there's any tiny little folded over areas, you can rearrange those. Then we're going to repeat the process of rolling 100 times from each end. Ideally, you want to roll it again another 400 times. That's 2 100s from each end. Finally, after rolling it 800 times, we're going to unroll it and then take the soapy water and sprinkle a little bit more soapy water on top of it. Now we're going to work on it by hand, and you can see how we're going to scrunch it up and jiggle it gently against the bubble wrap. Now you'll notice that I'm using my fingers just as though they're table legs, so that I'm not actually rubbing the silk against the bubble wrap. I'm making it dance against the bubble wrap so that it's moving backwards and forwards, but my hand isn't moving across the surface of the scarf. I know it looks as though I'm rubbing the scarf, but I'm making the scarf move on the surface. The reason for this is that if I use my hand and rub the surface, it'll make the wool pill and it'll come all fluffy through the texture. So instead, we're using this technique where we rub it backwards and forwards, and it's moving against the texture of the bubble wrap, which is encouraging the fibres to travel through the silk further and deeper. And the more you do this and squeeze it, so you squeeze out the soapy water and then stretch the scarf out to catch the soapy water again. It needs to be nice and wet and soapy. If we did this with a dry scarf, it would damage the wool. Sometimes I move the plastic so that I'm at right angles to it, so it's stretched out in front of me. Then I put the towel at the edge of the table to stop the water swishing against my legs. So now I'm wafting the scarf. I'm holding the whole of one end and gently making it dance and move against the bubble wrap. These are very soft, light gestures. My video is a little bit speeded up, so it looks a bit more lively than it actually is. Keep it nice and wet and soapy. Have a look and see if there's any details that need a little bit more work. Something that needs a little bit more work would be an area of silk that isn't properly attached to the wool. Then, with your fingers, make it move against the bubble wrap, and this will help the small fibres of merino wool travel into the silk. It's extraordinary how quickly this happens at this stage. Sometimes you can roll it up on itself, and this will help it felt together. I only roll it maybe 5 or 10 times so that it helps the wool move into the silk. Check your scarf, have a look at it, beautiful patterns. Check the edges, make sure they're not folded over, and very carefully tease out any folded edges. Try not to stretch your scarf at this point. Your scarf is now finished when the wool and silk are felted together and neither are lifting up when pinched. Rinse your scarf in warm water. Squeeze out the excess. Lay it out on the table, carefully reshaping it, and leave it flat to dry. Well done! Here's your beautiful luxury Nuno scarf felted.